The mahogany conference table gleamed under the chandelier's light as the family attorney cleared his throat. I could still smell my father's cologne lingering in the room. He'd always oversaturated the office with that distinctive sandalwood scent. Now, just 2 weeks after his passing, I sat across from my brother Richard, watching his face carefully. As per the last will and testament of Jonathan Harrison Sr., Mr. Winters announced, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, all properties, business interests, investments, and monetary assets are to be transferred in their entirety to Jonathan Harrison Jr. The words hung in the air like poison. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry. What about Eleanor?" My voice sounded distant, even to my own ears. Mr. Winters avoided my gaze, shuffling papers. "There are no provisions for Eleanor Harrison in the will." Richard's face transformed, the grief mask slipping to reveal a smile that never reached his eyes. "I tried to warn you, Ellie. Dad finally saw through you." "That's impossible," I whispered, my fingers gripping the leather armrests. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake." Richard stood, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. "You were always the disappointment. All those years pretending to care, and what did it get you? Nothing." He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Which is exactly what you deserve." 3 hours later, I stood on the driveway of Harrison Estate, the home where I'd grown up, with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of personal items. 38 years old, and everything I thought I knew had evaporated. The family's security guard, who had known me since childhood, avoided my eyes as he escorted me off the property. "I'm sorry, Miss Eleanor," he mumbled, looking at the ground. "Mr. Richard's orders." Rain started falling as my rideshare pulled away, the wrought iron gates closing behind me with mechanical finality. I didn't cry. I was too shocked for tears. Instead, I watched the raindrops race down the window, trying to make sense of what had happened. My brother and I had never been close. Richard was 7 years older, and had always been our father's clear favorite, the son who would inherit the Harrison construction empire. But I had been the one who stayed local, who visited Dad weekly after Mom's passing, who managed his medications and doctor appointments. I was the one who held his hand during chemotherapy while Richard was too busy in meetings. I was the one who renovated the guest house to move in and care for him when his health declined. Yet somehow, I'd been completely cut out. By evening, I had checked into a modest hotel in downtown Boston, the only accommodation I could afford on my limited savings. As a curator at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, a position I'd earned on merit despite Dad offering to pull strings, I made a comfortable living, but nowhere near enough to maintain the lifestyle I'd grown accustomed to at the Harrison Estate. I sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears to come as I scrolled through my phone. Already, 3 friends had canceled our plans with transparent excuses. Word traveled fast in Boston's elite circles, and nobody wanted to be associated with the disinherited Harrison daughter. 3 months, I whispered to myself, wiping away tears. I'll give myself 3 months to figure this out. I didn't know yet what figuring it out meant, but something deep inside me refused to accept this as the final chapter. My father, for all his flaws, had valued fairness. He had promised, on multiple occasions, that Richard and I would both be taken care of. Something wasn't right, and I intended to discover what. 3 traits had defined me since childhood: unwavering loyalty, strategic intelligence that often went unnoticed behind my quiet demeanor, and a silent determination that grew stronger when challenged. These qualities had sometimes been my downfall. My loyalty had kept me blindly devoted to a family that perhaps didn't deserve it. But now, they would become my salvation. The next morning, I woke with purpose and a growing suspicion. I reviewed the events of the past year. Dad's deteriorating health, Richard's sudden increased presence at the estate, the new advisors who limited my access, and finally, the abrupt change in the will just 3 weeks before Dad passed. My first step was finding affordable housing. Boston's real estate market was unforgiving. But by the afternoon, I had secured a small studio apartment in Somerville, a far cry from Harrison Estate's sprawling grounds, but it would serve as my base of operations. As I unpacked my meager belongings, I discovered something peculiar. In the lining of my old leather portfolio, a gift from Dad on my college graduation, I felt an unusual thickness. Carefully cutting along the seam, I found a small key taped to a business card for First National Bank of Boston. On the back, in my father's distinct handwriting, for E.H. only, Box 4291. My heart raced as I stared at this unexpected message from beyond the grave. Why would Dad hide this if he truly intended to leave me nothing? Was it possible that Richard had somehow manipulated the will? The conflict that would define my journey forward began to crystallize. My desire for justice warred with my need for emotional closure. Part of me wanted to expose whatever manipulation had occurred and reclaim my birthright. Another part questioned whether any inheritance was worth the darkness this fight would surely require me to embrace. That night, in my Spartan new apartment, I wrote 2 lists. The first contained practical steps: visit the bank, consult an independent lawyer, gather information on the will's witnesses. The second listed people I could potentially trust, a much shorter inventory. As I fell asleep on my newly purchased futon, Boston's city lights filtering through thin curtains, I knew that the comfortable, trusting person I had been was gone forever. The next 3 months would either destroy me completely or forge me into someone new, someone capable of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. What I couldn't possibly know was that my father had anticipated this betrayal long before I had, and had left breadcrumbs for me to follow, if I was clever enough to find them. The First National Bank of Boston stood like a fortress of limestone and marble in the financial district, its architecture a reminder of old money and established power, a world I'd been abruptly exiled from. I approached the customer service desk with the key clutched in my purse, suddenly aware of my casual attire amid the suits and tailored dresses. "I'd like to access a safe deposit box, please." I slid my ID across the counter. "Box 4291. The representative's demeanor changed subtly as she noted my name. "Ms. Harrison. Of course, if you'll follow me." In a private room, I inserted the key with trembling fingers. The box contained a sealed envelope, a small leather journal, and a flash drive. I opened the envelope first, finding a handwritten letter, dated just 5 months ago. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, I fear the worst has happened. Richard has always been ambitious, but lately I've seen something change in him. I've made arrangements to protect you, though I can't put everything in writing. This journal contains codes and locations. Trust Margaret. She alone knows the whole truth. I've set aside what I could. Be careful who you trust. With all my love." Daddy blinked back tears, his words confirming my suspicions. But who was Margaret? The name wasn't familiar. The journal contained what appeared to be random numbers, locations, and dates spanning 40 years. The flash drive would have to wait until I was somewhere private. I returned everything to my bag, a strange mix of validation and dread washing over me. As I exited the bank, the crisp October air bit at my cheeks. Boston's autumn had arrived with vibrant colors transforming the common, a stark contrast to the gray uncertainty of my future. I found a quiet cafe near Government Center and ordered a chai latte, an indulgence I should probably forgo given my new financial reality. I was scrolling through my contacts, wondering if anyone named Margaret might be listed, when a text message arrived from an unknown number. "Harrison Construction Lobby, 3 p.m. Come alone. A friend." My strategic mind immediately analyzed the risk. It could be a trap, but it could also be the Margaret mentioned in my father's letter. For nearly an hour, I debated my options before deciding that calculated risks would be necessary in this new chapter of my life. At precisely 3 p.m., I entered the soaring lobby of the Harrison Construction headquarters, a building I'd visited countless times, but now felt unwelcome in. I chose a seat with a view of all entrances, my back to the wall. At 3:05, an elderly woman in a gray pantsuit approached. She had worked as my father's executive assistant for over 30 years, though I'd always known her as Ms. Peterson. "Ms. Peterson?" I said, rising to greet her. "Please, call me Margaret." She glanced around nervously. "I don't have much time. Richard has been letting people go, anyone with loyalty to your father. Margaret Peterson, the name from the letter. My father's most trusted employee." "My father mentioned you in a letter," I said quietly. He said you know the truth. She nodded, sliding a business card across the table. Not here, my home. Friday, evening, 7 p.m. She stood to leave, then hesitated. Eleanor, be careful. Your brother has changed. There are things you don't know about the company, about what happened in those final months. As she walked away, a familiar figure entered the lobby. Diane Chen, my closest friend since college and the company's legal counsel. Her eyes widened when she saw me. But instead of approaching, she quickly diverted to the elevators. I felt the sting of another betrayal. Diane and I had been inseparable for nearly 2 decades. Her avoidance spoke volumes. Back in my apartment, I inserted the flash drive into my laptop. It contained hundreds of files, financial records, emails, and photographs spanning years. Most significant was a folder labeled Project Phoenix, containing documents showing that Richard had been systematically transferring company assets to a shell corporation for the past 18 months. I spent hours combing through the evidence, piecing together a disturbing picture. Richard had been siphoning money, preparing for something big, but the full scope remained unclear without additional context. Friday couldn't come fast enough. I spent the intervening days in research mode, digging into Massachusetts inheritance, law, and creating timelines of events leading to my father's passing. I also began recording everything in a dedicated notebook. Conversations, discoveries, suspicions. The most painful task was evaluating who among my inner circle might still be trustworthy. One by one, longtime friends had distanced themselves, some overtly, others with polite excuses. The Harrison name carried weight in Boston society, and few wanted to risk Richard's displeasure by maintaining connections with the disinherited sister. By Friday evening, as I approached Margaret's modest colonial home in Arlington, I had developed the beginnings of a plan. Knowledge was power, and I needed more of both. Margaret welcomed me with a sad smile, ushering me through a living room filled with photographs, many featuring my father at company events. Tea? She offered, hands slightly trembling as she set out delicate cups that reminded me of my mother's collection. Margaret, I need to understand what happened. How did Richard manage to change the will? She sighed, settling into an armchair. Your father always intended an equal division. But last December, when the treatments intensified, Richard began limiting access to him. New nurses, new security, all reporting to your brother. But how could Dad agree to cut me out completely? He didn't. Margaret's voice hardened. Jonathan never signed that will. I'm certain of it. I leaned forward. You're suggesting forgery? I'm suggesting something even more insidious. Richard began using an experimental medication on your father, supposedly to help with his cognitive function. After that, Jonathan became increasingly suggestible. The implication sent a chill through me. Are you saying Richard drugged our father to manipulate him? I can't prove it, but I overheard things. Margaret pulled out a worn leather appointment book. I kept notes, dates, visitors, medications. Jonathan wasn't himself in those final weeks. He would never have disinherited. You. She handed me the appointment book and an antique key. This opens your father's private study at the summer house in Rockport. Richard doesn't know about it. It was your grandmother's addition. There's a hidden safe behind the painting of Marblehead Harbor. As I drove back to Somerville that night, my mind raced with implications. If Margaret was right, Richard hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He'd violated our father's trust in the most fundamental way. The question was no longer just about reclaiming my share, but about exposing a profound betrayal. Back in my apartment, I added Margaret's information to my growing case file. The appointment book contained meticulous records, not just of meetings, but of my father's health patterns, medication changes, and notable quotes. It painted a damning picture of Richard's increasing control. That night, I dreamed of the summer house, a weathered cedar-shingled cottage overlooking the Atlantic that had been our grandmother's pride. In childhood summers, Richard and I had briefly found common ground there, building sandcastles and searching for sea glass. That shared history now felt like a cruel joke. My phone woke me at 3 a.m., a text from Margaret. R knows we met. Office. Being searched tomorrow. Be careful. And just like that, the stakes escalated. Richard was now actively monitoring me, which meant I needed to be even more strategic. But it also meant I was on the right track. I spent the remainder of the night researching private investigators, finally settling on Sullivan Investigations, a small firm with excellent reviews and no obvious connections to Harrison Construction. I would need professional help to gather admissible evidence. As dawn broke over Boston, I watched the sunrise from my window, the first golden rays illuminating a city I'd known all my life, but now saw through entirely new eyes. 3 days into my 3-month timeline, I finally had a direction. What I didn't realize was that Richard had anticipated my moves and was already working to eliminate the trail of breadcrumbs our father had left for me. The Rockport summer house stood weathered and neglected against the October sky, Atlantic waves crashing rhythmically against the rocky shore below. I hadn't visited in nearly 2 years, not since the Thanksgiving when Dad announced his illness. The property technically belonged to Richard now, but he rarely used it, preferring luxury resorts for his vacations. I parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot along the beach, the cold sand crunching beneath my boots. Breaking in felt wrong, but using the hidden spare key beneath the porch planter felt justified. This had been my childhood haven too. Inside, sheets draped the furniture like ghosts of happier times. I moved silently through the house, inhaling the familiar scent of old wood and sea air. Grandmother's study, a small room with panoramic ocean views, remained untouched, seemingly forgotten in Richard's inventory of assets. The painting of Marblehead Harbor hung slightly askew, just as it always had. Behind it, exactly as Margaret had described, was a small wall safe. The key fit perfectly. Inside, I found a sealed manila envelope labeled Contingency, a vintage Polaroid camera, and a leather-bound notebook filled with my father's distinctive handwriting. Heart-pounding, I opened the envelope first. It contained formal documents establishing a trust in my name, separate from the family business and main estate. According to the paperwork, my father had secretly allocated $2.3 million to this trust, along with ownership of a small property in Vermont I'd never heard of. The trust had been created 18 months ago, with activation instructions in case of unforeseen circumstances preventing standard inheritance procedures. I sat heavily in my grandmother's reading chair, processing this revelation. Dad had suspected something might happen and had created a safety net for me. But why the secrecy? Why not tell me? The notebook provided context, journal entries, documenting my father's growing concerns about Richard's business decisions and ethical choices. The final entries were particularly disturbing. April 3rd, Richard proposing partnership with Westlake Development despite their environmental violations. Strongly opposed. April 17th, found unauthorized transfers to Cayman accounts. Confronted Richard. Unsatisfactory explanation. May 8th, evidence of bribery in the Cambridge project. Must investigate further. May 22nd, health declining faster than expected. Worry R knows I'm investigating. Creating safeguards for Eleanor. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before his passing, was scrawled in shaky handwriting. If anything happens, Eleanor must find Margaret, Sullivan, and Vernon. The truth is, in the photographs in Ledger 7, Sullivan, likely the same Sullivan as the investigation firm I'd researched. But who was Vernon? And what photographs? The Polaroid camera suddenly seemed significant. I spent an hour photographing everything with my phone before carefully returning. Items to the safe. As I was preparing to leave, headlights swept across the windows. A vehicle coming up the private drive. Panic surged through me as I quickly turned off my flashlight. Peering cautiously through the curtains, I recognized Richard's Mercedes SUV. Had he somehow known I'd be here? I had minutes at most before he'd enter. The back door, leading to a wooden staircase down to the beach, was my only option. I slipped outside, the cold air hitting my lungs as I carefully pulled the door closed behind me. Crouching behind a large rock, I watched as lights came on in the main house. From my hiding place, I could see Richard through the windows, moving purposefully through rooms, checking closets and cabinets. He was searching for something, perhaps the very documents I'd just found. After an agonizing hour, Richard finally emerged carrying a cardboard box. He loaded it into his car and drove away, unaware of my presence just yards from the house. I remained hidden for another 30 minutes, ensuring he was truly gone before retrieving my car and driving back to Boston, my mind whirling with questions and partial answers. The next morning, I contacted Sullivan Investigations and scheduled an appointment. If Margaret had been correct about Richard drugging our father, I needed professional evidence gatherers on my side. Jack Sullivan turned out to be a former Boston PD detective in his 60s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing as I explained my situation. Harrison Construction, he mused, tapping his desk. Your brother's making waves in development circles, not all good. Did you know my father? I asked, remembering the journal entry. Sullivan's expression shifted subtly. We had mutual acquaintances. Look, Ms. Harrison, what you're describing, potential manipulation, possible forgery, that's serious business. Your brother has resources and connections. So did my father, I countered. And he seemed to think you could help if things went wrong. Sullivan studied me for a long moment before opening a drawer and removing a business card. Vernon Blackwood, attorney. Tell him Jack sent you. As I left Sullivan's office, a call came from an unknown number. Warily, I answered. Eleanor? It's Diane. My former best friend's voice sounded strained. We need to talk. Not over the phone. The Gardner Museum Cafe, 1 hour? The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum had been our special place in college, the site of late-night study sessions when we had access through Diane's internship. The choice of location seemed deliberate, appealing to our history. I arrived early, choosing a corner table with a view of both entrances. Diane appeared precisely on time, her corporate attorney facade firmly in place despite it being Saturday. You're investigating Richard, she said without preamble, sliding into the seat across from me. I maintained a neutral expression. Why would you think that? Because I would, in your position. She leaned forward. And because he's suddenly very interested in your movements. He asked me to review options for a restraining order against you. The betrayal stung freshly. And you're helping him. I'm here, aren't I? Her voice dropped. Eleanor, you don't understand what's happening at Harrison. Things have changed since your father stepped back. Richard has new partners. Powerful. People who don't play by conventional rules. What do you know about the will? I asked directly. Diane glanced around before answering. I wasn't involved in that specific document. Richard used outside counsel. But she hesitated. The timing was suspicious, and the witnesses weren't the usual choices. Are you saying it might be contestable? I'm saying be careful. Richard is scared of something. Has been for months. That makes him dangerous. She stood to leave. I can't be seen helping you, but check your email tonight. Company server backup codes. Use them wisely. As she walked away, I called after her. Why are you still there? If you know something's wrong. She paused, not turning around. Someone needs to document what's happening. Then she was gone, leaving me with more questions than answers. That evening, as promised, an email arrived from an anonymous account. Server access information for Harrison Construction's internal systems. Diane was taking an enormous professional risk by providing this. Using the codes, I accessed years of company records, downloading everything I could. Around midnight, I discovered something startling. References to Project Lighthouse involving property acquisitions in Vermont, the same state where my father had secretly purchased land for my trust. I cross-referenced locations, finding that Dad's property sat adjacent to parcels that Harrison Construction had been quietly buying through shell companies. According to internal memos, the area was being evaluated for a massive resort development, one that would require damming a river that ran through my newly discovered property. Dad hadn't just set aside money for me. He'd strategically blocked Richard's biggest project by placing the crucial waterway under my control. As this realization dawned, my phone chimed with a text from Margaret. Don't come to work Monday. Richard fired me. Office being cleared. Get to Vernon ASAP. Events were accelerating. I needed to meet with Vernon Blackwood immediately, before Richard could eliminate more evidence or allies. The conflict between justice and forgiveness tilted further toward justice with each revelation of my brother's apparent corruption. That night, as autumn rain lashed against my windows, I updated my timeline and evidence log, adding photographs from the summer house safe. The mysterious Polaroid camera still puzzled me. Why had Dad included it? What photographs was I supposed to find or take? As I finally drifted to sleep, my dreams were filled with running water, the Vermont stream flowing between my fingers as I tried desperately to contain it, while Richard stood on the opposite bank, systematically demolishing our childhood, summer house stone by stone. Vernon Blackwood's law office occupied the third floor of a converted textile mill in Lowell, 30 minutes outside Boston. The space, all exposed brick and wooden beams, conveyed established professionalism without ostentation. Vernon himself, an African-American man in his late 60s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, exuded a similar quiet authority. "Eleanor Harrison," he said, rising from behind his desk as his assistant showed me in. "I've been wondering when you'd find your way here." "You've been expecting me? Your father thought you might need my services eventually." Vernon gestured to a chair. "I was sorry to hear of his passing. Jonathan was a good man, better than most who achieve his level of success. I studied him, trying to place him in the constellation of my father's associates. I don't recall meeting you before. By design. My connection to your father wasn't public knowledge." Vernon removed his glasses. "I specialize in what you might call corporate malfeasance cases, whistleblowers, fraud investigations, that sort of thing. Your father consulted me about certain concerns regarding Harrison Construction's operations under your brother's increasing influence." My heart quickened. "Then you know about the shell companies? The offshore accounts?" Vernon's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've been busy." I briefed him on my discoveries thus far. The secret trust, the Vermont property, Margaret's allegations about medication manipulation, and Diane's server access. Vernon listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. "This presents several potential legal avenues," he said when I'd finished. "The will could potentially be challenged on grounds of undue influence or diminished capacity. The corporate issues, misappropriation of funds, potential environmental violations, those are separate matters that could provide leverage." "I'm not just looking for leverage," I clarified. "If Richard manipulated our father and is corrupting the company, he should face consequences." Vernon studied me. "Justice and vengeance often wear similar masks, Ms. Harrison. Your father wanted to protect you and his legacy, not destroy your brother." His words struck an uncomfortable chord. Was I pursuing justice or revenge? The line seemed increasingly blurred. "What would you suggest?" I asked finally. "Strategic patience. You've made excellent progress gathering evidence, but we need more, particularly regarding your father's mental state and medication changes in those final months. I have contacts at the hospital who might help discreetly." Vernon outlined next steps, including filing for a temporary injunction preventing Richard from selling or transferring certain assets, particularly the Vermont property adjacent to my trust land. "This won't be quick or easy," he warned. "Your brother has considerable resources and connections. We'll need to build an airtight case." As I left Vernon's office with a retainer agreement and renewed sense of purpose, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Harrison Construction announces major Vermont resort development. Lighthouse Mountain project to begin spring construction. Richard was accelerating his timeline. I needed to do the same. Back in my apartment, I began organizing my growing evidence into categories: will manipulation, financial misdeeds, and environmental concerns. The latter seemed particularly significant given my father's long-standing commitment to sustainable development, a value Richard clearly didn't share. An email from Sullivan Investigations arrived with preliminary findings. Richard had indeed changed my father's medical team 3 months before his passing, bringing in specialists from a private practice with connections to a pharmaceutical company developing experimental cognitive drugs. Most disturbing was confirmation that 2 of the will's witnesses had left the country shortly after my father's passing. One to Dubai, another to Singapore. Both had received substantial payments from an LLC connected to Richard. As I absorbed these findings, my doorbell rang, unexpected and concerning, since the building required a key fob for entry. Through the peephole, I was shocked to see Hannah Morris, my father's home health nurse during his final months. "Eleanor," she said when I opened the door, her expression tense. "I'm sorry for just showing up. I've been trying to find you since the funeral." I ushered her inside, immediately noting how thin she'd become, dark circles prominent beneath her eyes. "Your brother fired the entire care team the day after your father passed," she explained, declining my offer of tea. "Made us sign NDAs before receiving final payment." "But you're here anyway," I observed. Hannah twisted her hands in her lap. "What happened wasn't right. Your father would have these moments of clarity where he'd realize something was wrong. He'd ask for you. But Richard always had excuses for why you couldn't come." My throat tightened. "I was there 3 times a week." "Not in those final weeks. Security had instructions. You were limited to scheduled visits, always with Richard or his people present." Hannah reached into her bag, removing a small notebook. "I kept records of the medication changes. The new drugs weren't on the approved list from his primary oncologist." I accepted the notebook with trembling hands. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because your father made me promise." Her eyes welled with tears. The night before he passed, he had this moment of complete lucidity. He grabbed my hand and said, "Tell Eleanor to look beneath the chessboard. Look beneath the chessboard. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't protect her from him." The chessboard. My father's antique chess set that had always sat in his study. I hadn't seen it during the will reading or while clearing my personal items. "Thank you for coming forward," I said, my mind already racing ahead. This could make a significant difference. After Hannah left, I immediately called Vernon to relay this new information. He agreed it potentially strengthened a case for undue influence, but cautioned that Hannah's testimony alone, given after signing an NDA, might face challenges. "We need the chess set," he advised, "and we need to know what's beneath it." Accessing Harrison Estate again wouldn't be simple. Security knew me, but Richard had likely given specific instructions regarding my potential return. I needed a different approach. I called Margaret, who confirmed my suspicions. "The chess set is still in the study. Richard never cared for your father's old-fashioned games, as he called them. Is there any way I could get into the house?" I asked. "Not through conventional means." "But," she hesitated. "The annual Harrison Foundation Gala is Friday evening. The house will be full of people. Security will be focused on the main event." The Foundation Gala, a charity event my mother had established decades ago, now a highlight of Boston's social calendar. In previous years, I'd helped organize it. This year, I hadn't even received an invitation. How would I get in? Richard would spot me immediately. "Not if you're working staff," Margaret suggested. "I still have connections with the catering company." It was risky, but potentially our only opportunity to discover what my father had hidden beneath the chessboard. I agreed to Margaret's plan, simultaneously asking Vernon to expedite the injunction filing regarding the Vermont property. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation. Vernon confirmed that the injunction would be filed Thursday, likely giving us a day before Richard was formally notified. Sullivan's team continued gathering evidence on the medical manipulation angle, while I worked through company documents Diane had provided access to. A pattern emerged in the financial records. Harrison Construction had begun shifting from its traditional focus on sustainable urban development toward more environmentally problematic projects shortly after Richard took operational control. The Vermont Lighthouse Mountain Resort represented the culmination of this shift. A massive development that would fundamentally alter the regional ecosystem. Environmental impact reports had been drafted, but never finalized. Internal emails revealed pressure on staff scientists to reconsider findings regarding watershed impacts. The river running through my newly discovered property appeared to be the key obstacle. Its damming would directly affect protected wetlands downstream. My father's journal entries now made perfect sense. He had purchased that specific Vermont property knowing it would prevent Richard from proceeding with a project that violated our family's long-standing environmental principles. Friday evening arrived with driving rain, appropriate for the covert operation I was about to undertake. Dressed in the catering company's standard black pants and white shirt, hair tucked under a cap, I arrived at the service entrance of Harrison Estate amid the controlled chaos of event preparation. Margaret's contact, the catering manager, positioned me on beverage service for the library wing, conveniently adjacent to my father's study. The library would be open to guests, but used primarily as a quiet conversation area, away from the main reception in the grand hall. As guests began arriving, I kept my head down, focusing on replenishing wine glasses and clearing empty plates. From peripheral glimpses, I recognized dozens of Boston's elite. People who had been family friends for decades but now moved past me without a second glance, my server's uniform rendering me effectively invisible. Richard made his grand entrance, an hour into the event, commanding attention with practiced charm. On his arm was Diane, a development that momentarily stole my breath. My former best friend, now apparently aligned with my brother in more than just professional capacities. Their body language suggested intimacy, confirming suspicions I'd harbored but pushed aside. How long had this been going on? Had Diane's recent help been genuine, or was she playing both sides? I forced myself to focus on the mission. Shortly after 9 p.m., when the event was in full swing, I slipped unnoticed into my father's study and locked the door behind me. The room remained largely as I remembered. Leather-bound books lining mahogany. Shelves, the faint scent of pipe tobacco still lingering despite my father having given up the habit years ago. The chess set sat on a side table by the fireplace, pieces arranged mid-game, just as Dad always kept them. With trembling hands, I carefully lifted the heavy marble chess set, revealing nothing unusual beneath. Puzzled, I examined the board more closely, noticing slight irregularities in the pattern of the wood. Pressing experimentally on one corner, I heard a faint click as a false bottom released. Inside the hidden compartment lay a sealed envelope and a small recorder. The envelope contained legal documents, copies of the original will that left the estate divided equally between Richard and me, properly witnessed and notarized 6 months before Dad's passing. The recorder contained something even more damning. My father's voice, weak but determined, stating that any subsequent changes to his will were made under duress and manipulation by Richard. The recording included specific details of medication changes and limited access to legal counsel. As I was processing these discoveries, a key turned in the study door. I quickly returned the chess set to its position, slipping the evidence into my shirt just as the door opened. Richard stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to cold anger. I thought our security team was more competent, sneaking in as catering staff. I have to admire the resourcefulness, if not the desperation. "This is still my home too," I replied, striving for composure despite my pounding heart. "No, it's not anymore." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "What exactly do you hope to accomplish with these amateur detective games, Eleanor? Challenging the will? Digging into company business that doesn't concern you?" "Dad never intended to cut me out completely," I stated firmly. "You manipulated him when he was vulnerable." A cold smile played across Richard's face. "Prove it." "Oh wait, you can't. The witnesses are unavailable, the medical records are sealed, and frankly, no one would believe you over me. I'm the one continuing Dad's legacy while you arranged flower displays at the museum." His dismissive tone sparked unexpected anger. "Is that legacy destroying protected wetlands in Vermont? Bribing officials for permits? Using experimental drugs to manipulate our dying father?" Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at the specificity of my accusations. "You've been busy. Dad raised us both with principles, Richard. What happened to yours?" "I grew up," he snapped. "Dad's principles were luxuries afforded by inherited wealth. I'm building something bigger, something that will truly secure the Harrison legacy." By corrupting everything he stood for, Richard moved closer, his voice dropping. "Let me make something perfectly clear. Whatever you think you know, whatever evidence you believe you've found, it won't be enough. I've spent years preparing for this transition. Every contingency has been addressed. Except the Vermont property," I countered, watching his reaction carefully. "Dad outsmarted you there." Genuine confusion crossed his features. "What are you talking about?" "A small victory. Richard didn't yet know about my trust property blocking his development. You'll find out soon enough." The study door opened again, revealing Diane, elegant in a blue gown that matched her eyes that widened with shock upon seeing me. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" "Just reminiscing," I replied coldly. "Apparently you and my brother have been doing the same." Richard placed a possessive hand on Diane's waist. "Eleanor was just leaving, permanently this time. Would you call security, darling?" The endearment landed like a physical blow. Darling. How long had this betrayal been in the works? I moved toward the door with dignity I didn't feel. "No need. I've seen everything I came to see." As security escorted me from the property for the second time, rain soaking through my thin catering uniform, I clutched the evidence against my chest. Proof of both my father's true intentions and Richard's manipulation. What I couldn't have anticipated was how quickly Richard would move to counter my discovery, or how dangerous the next phase of our battle would become. Monday morning brought the expected legal counterattack from Richard, as I sat in Vernon's office reviewing the temporary injunction he'd secured on Friday, successfully blocking any development on the Vermont properties pending further investigation. His assistant interrupted with breaking news. "Richard, Harrison has filed harassment charges against you," Vernon summarized, scanning the complaint. "Trespassing, theft of corporate documents, violation of confidentiality agreements. He's painting you as a disgruntled family member manufacturing conspiracy theories." "We have the recording," I reminded him, "and the original will, which helps our inheritance case but doesn't address these new allegations." Vernon removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "He's moving aggressively, Eleanor. Aggressively, Eleanor. The harassment filing includes a temporary restraining order preventing you from contacting Harrison Construction employees or entering any Harrison properties." The implications were clear. Richard was systematically cutting off my access to potential allies and evidence. More concerning was the speed of his response, suggesting he might know exactly what I'd found in the chess set. "There's something else," Vernon continued, his expression grave. "Your apartment was searched while you were here." My blood ran cold. "How do you know?" "Because Sullivan's team had it under surveillance, anticipating Richard might make such a move. 2 men entered approximately 30 minutes ago. They appeared to be looking for something specific. The evidence from the chess set," I concluded. "I have it with me, fortunately." Vernon nodded approvingly. "Nevertheless, you shouldn't return there. Richard is escalating beyond legal maneuvers. I suggest a hotel for tonight while we arrange more secure accommodations." As I left Vernon's office, my phone buzzed with an email notification. My museum supervisor regretfully informing me that budgetary constraints necessitated eliminating my position, effective immediately. Richard's influence was extending beyond family affairs, systematically dismantling my professional life as well. I checked into a hotel near Fenway Park, using cash, a precaution Sullivan had recommended. The room was small but clean, anonymous in its generic corporate decor. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the gravity of my situation finally hit full force. In just 2 weeks, I'd lost my family home, my inheritance, and now my job. My apartment was compromised. Former friends had chosen sides, and my own brother was targeting me with increasing aggression. The emotional weight was crushing. For the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself to truly break down. Curled on the hotel bed, I sobbed until my throat was raw and my eyes burned. Was any inheritance worth this? Was exposing Richard's manipulation worth the complete destruction of what remained of my life? As twilight fell over Boston, I stood at the window watching lights illuminate across the city. The conflict that had been brewing within me. Justice versus forgiveness, exposure versus peace, reached its crescendo. Could I simply walk away? Take the trust fund my father had secretly established and build a new life somewhere far from Richard and Harrison Construction? My phone rang, interrupting these thoughts. An unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered. "Eleanor? It's Hannah, the nurse. Are you somewhere safe?" Her urgency alarmed me. "Yes. Why?" "2 men came to my apartment asking questions about your father's medication records and the conversation I had with you. They implied I could face legal consequences for violating my NDA." Her voice trembled. "Eleanor, I think they followed me to work today." "Did they threaten you physically?" "Not explicitly, but it felt dangerous." She paused. "There's something else. I remembered something about your father's medication. There was a specific drug, not on his original protocol, that Richard's doctor insisted on. I researched it after our meeting. It's an experimental compound that affects memory formation and decision-making. The clinical trials were suspended over ethical concerns. This confirmation of Margaret's suspicions about medication manipulation strengthened our case considerably. "Hannah, you should stay somewhere else tonight," I advised, "and send me everything you have on that medication." After the call, I contacted Vernon to relay this development. He agreed the medication information could be crucial but was concerned about Hannah's safety. Richard appears to be identifying and neutralizing potential witnesses, he observed grimly. We should accelerate our timeline. The next morning, I relocated to a different hotel under a false name, using cash again. Vernon arranged an emergency court hearing regarding the restraining order, arguing it was an attempt to obstruct legitimate legal inquiry into the validity of my father's will. While Vernon focused on the legal front, I pursued another angle: the environmental implications of the Vermont development. Using contacts from my museum work, I connected with an environmental advocacy organization that had been monitoring development threats to Vermont watersheds. Melissa Oakes, the organization's director, met me in a Cambridge coffee shop, bringing satellite imagery and ecological impact assessments of the region, including Richard's proposed resort location. This development would be devastating for the entire watershed, she explained, spreading maps across our table. The river running through these properties feeds protected wetlands that support endangered species. Our preliminary assessment suggests the development would violate at least 3 federal environmental protection statutes. My brother is moving aggressively to begin construction this spring, I told her. He's already secured most of the necessary permits. Melissa's expression darkened. Through questionable means, according to our sources. We've been monitoring this situation for months but haven't been able to identify the beneficial owners behind the shell companies buying the land. Harrison Construction's involvement changes things significantly. What if you had evidence of permit manipulation? I asked carefully. And access to internal documents showing awareness of environmental impacts being deliberately suppressed? Her eyes widened. That would fundamentally change our strategic options. We could potentially file for federal intervention. This approach offered a new avenue, one that focused on stopping Richard's environmentally destructive project, rather than just reclaiming my inheritance. It aligned with my father's values and might provide leverage without depending solely on proving will manipulation. After leaving Melissa with copies of select internal Harrison Construction documents, I received an urgent call from Vernon. The judge denied our motion to lift the restraining order, he reported. But that's not the worst news. Richard has filed to have your trust dissolved, claiming your father was under undue influence when establishing it. Can he do that? It's a stretch legally, but it buys him time and freezes the assets while litigation proceeds. He's trying to cut off your financial resources. Vernon sounded genuinely concerned. Eleanor, Richard seems to know exactly what we're doing at every step. I'm beginning to suspect my office may be compromised. The implications were chilling. If Richard had infiltrated Vernon's office, what other surveillance might be in place? Who else might be reporting to him? That evening, as I sat in my hotel room reviewing Vermont property documents, a knock at the door startled me. I approached, cautiously, remembering Sullivan's warnings about security. "Room service," called a female voice. I hadn't ordered anything. There must be a mistake. Complimentary from management. For Ms. Smith. The alias I was using. Against my better judgment, I opened the door slightly, chain still in place. To my shock, Diane stood in the hallway, alone and visibly nervous. "I need to talk to you," she whispered. "Please." After a moment's hesitation, I let her in, maintaining a safe distance between us. "How did you find me?" "I've known you for 20 years, Ellie. The Red Sox are playing tonight, and this hotel has a view of Fenway. It wasn't hard to guess." She remained standing, declining my gesture toward a chair. "I don't have much time. Richard doesn't know I'm here. Why should I believe anything you say?" The betrayal still stung sharply. "You're sleeping with the man who stole my inheritance." Diane winced. "It's complicated. Richard and it started during your father's illness. I thought I could influence him, moderate some of his worst impulses." She looked away. "Obviously, I failed. So what changed? Why are you here?" "Because of what I found today." She pulled a flash drive from her pocket. "Richard is panicking about your Vermont property blocking the lighthouse project. He's authorized bribes to EPA officials to fast-track approvals before your injunction can be fully implemented." I accepted the drive warily. Again, why should I trust this isn't some trap? Because despite everything, I've never stopped being your friend. And because I finally realized that Richard crossed lines I can't ignore. Her voice broke slightly. Your father deserved better. So do you. Despite my reservations, the emotion in her voice seemed genuine. What's on the drive? Everything? Emails confirming the bribes, the original environmental impact studies, and something else you should know. Diane hesitated. There's a board meeting tomorrow. Richard is pushing for immediate action on the Vermont development, claiming all obstacles have been addressed. What does that mean? I don't know exactly, but he seemed unusually confident given your injunction. She moved toward the door. I need to get back before he notices I'm gone. Be careful, Ellie. Richard is not the person I thought he was. After Diane left, I immediately backed up the flash drive contents to cloud storage before reviewing the files. What I found was more damning than expected. Explicit discussions of paying off officials, falsifying environmental studies, and manipulating local Vermont political figures to support the development. Most concerning was an email from Richard sent that morning. Property obstacle being permanently resolved tomorrow. Proceed with contractor mobilization as planned. What permanent resolution was Richard planning for my trust property? Whatever it was, I had less than 24 hours to counter it. I called Vernon, who agreed the timing was worrying. The board meeting suggests he's found a way around the injunction. The reference to permanent resolution is particularly concerning. Could he be planning to physically alter the property? I suggested. Maybe dam the river before further legal action can stop him? That would violate the injunction, but if he's already bribing officials… Vernon trailed off. We need to get someone to the property immediately to document current conditions and monitor for any activity. Sullivan's team was already stretched thin with surveillance and evidence gathering in Boston. Melissa's environmental group was based in Burlington, relatively close to the property, but might not be able to mobilize quickly enough. I'll go myself, I decided. I can drive to Vermont tonight and be at the property by morning, Vernon protested, citing security concerns. But I was resolute. No one knows about my connection to that property yet except you, Margaret, and Richard. I'll be careful. After ending the call, I packed quickly, checking out of the hotel and using rideshare apps to reach a rental car agency where I secured a vehicle under my alias. By 10 p.m., I was heading north on I-93, Boston's lights fading behind me as dense forests and mountains loomed ahead. The 5-hour drive through darkness gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed. In just over 2 weeks, the comfortable, trusting person I'd been seemed like a distant memory. In her place was someone more cautious, more strategic, and perhaps more like Richard than I cared to admit. That thought was deeply unsettling. In pursuing justice against my brother, was I becoming what I claimed to despise? The questions haunted me as miles of highway disappeared beneath my wheels. Near the Vermont border, my phone rang. Vernon again. Eleanor, where are you exactly? His voice held unusual urgency. Just crossing into Vermont. What's wrong? Sullivan just called. Richard's security team found your hotel. They were searching the room when his people arrived for the surveillance. Shift. Whatever you're planning, Richard may already know. The implications were chilling. If Richard had connected me to the Vermont property and knew I was heading there, I could be driving into a dangerous situation. Should I turn back? I asked, already knowing the answer I would give, regardless of his response. It might be safer, Vernon admitted. But given the permanent resolution email, someone needs to document whatever Richard is planning. Just be extremely careful. Stay in public spaces when possible, and check in regularly. As I continued north through Vermont's moonlit landscape of rolling hills and dense forests, a new determination took hold. This journey was no longer just about reclaiming my inheritance or exposing Richard's manipulation. It was about honoring my father's final efforts to protect both me and the environmental principles our family had long stood for. What I couldn't know as I drove through the night was that Richard had indeed discovered my destination and had dispatched people to ensure his permanent resolution proceeded without interference. Dawn broke over the Green Mountains as I reached the small town of Riversdale, Vermont, the nearest settlement to my newly discovered property. The main street consisted of a general store, a diner, a post office, and a handful of other businesses catering to locals and seasonal tourists. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with the previous winter's snow despite the May warmth. At the Riversdale Diner, I ordered breakfast while examining property maps. According to the trust documents, my land encompassed approximately 40 acres, including a critical half-mile stretch of the Clearwater River, a pristine waterway that wound through the valley before joining larger river systems feeding Lake Champlain. "You looking to buy around here?" asked the waitress, setting down my coffee. "Actually, I recently inherited some property," I replied carefully. "Near Clearwater River." Her expression changed subtly. "Harrison Land?" The question startled me. "You know the Harrison name?" "Everybody does lately. Big development company buying up half the valley for some luxury resort." She frowned. "Not everyone's happy about it. That river's been the lifeblood of this community for generations. This presented an opportunity for local insight. What have you heard about the development? Promises of jobs and tourism dollars. But those of us who've seen developers come and go know better." She gestured toward an elderly man at the counter. "That's Walter Jenkins. His family's farmed along that river for over a century. He might tell you more about what's really at stake." Walter Jenkins proved to be a wealth of information about local history and the potential impact of Richard's development. Over a second cup of coffee, he explained how the watershed sustained the valley's agriculture and wildlife. "This ain't just about pretty views for rich folks' vacation homes," he explained, weathered hands wrapped around his mug. "That river system supports everything that makes this valley special. Dam it up like they're planning, and you destroy ecosystems that took millennia to develop." "Has anyone organized opposition to the development?" I asked. "Been trying. But this Harrison outfit, they're clever. Bought the local paper, sponsored the town festival, promised the mayor a community center as part of the development." Walter shook his head. "Hard to fight that kind of money with just farmers and small business owners." I didn't reveal my connection to Harrison Construction, instead presenting myself as an environmental researcher. Walter offered to show me some of the threatened areas, including access points to my property, which I gratefully accepted. Walter's truck bounced along dirt roads, eventually stopping at a ridge overlooking a breathtaking valley. Below, the Clearwater River wound like a silver ribbon through forests and meadows. In the distance, construction equipment sat idle near cleared areas. The preliminary work for Richard's resort. "That's where they plan to put the main dam," Walter indicated. "Right about where that bend in the river is. Best fishing spot in the county. Been coming here since I was a boy." I consulted my property maps, confirming my suspicion. The planned dam location was directly on my trust property. No wonder Richard had been so confident about permanently resolving the obstacle. He intended to begin construction immediately, creating a situation where even if I proved ownership, the environmental damage would already be done. "When is construction supposed to start?" I asked. "Word is they're moving equipment in tomorrow. Fast-tracked permits somehow." Walter's disgust was evident. Never seen approval process move so quick, especially with protected species in the area. This aligned with Diane's information about bribes to EPA officials. Richard was accelerating the timeline, trying to create irreversible momentum. After Walter dropped me back in town, I rented a local guide's ATV to access my property directly. The trust documents mentioned a small cabin that my father had purchased along with the land, potentially useful as both shelter and a base for monitoring activity. The ATV journey took nearly an hour, following logging trails through dense forest before reaching a clearing overlooking the river. The cabin, a rustic one-room structure with a small porch, stood weathered but solid, clearly built to withstand harsh Vermont winters. Using the key from the trust documents, I entered to find a space that was basic but functional. Wood stove, simple kitchen setup, a bed, table, and chair. Solar panels on the roof provided limited electricity. Most surprising was a ham radio setup in one corner, an old-fashioned but effective communication method in an area with spotty cell service. As I explored, I noticed something odd about one wall panel. Pressing experimentally, I discovered another of my father's hidden compartments. Inside was a waterproof case containing documents, detailed environmental studies of the river system, evidence of rare species habitats, and most significantly, proof that Harrison Construction had received preliminary reports documenting these endangered ecosystems, but had suppressed the information. This evidence would be invaluable to Melissa's environmental organization and potentially to federal regulators. But getting it back to Boston would mean leaving the property unmonitored during the critical period when Richard's team might arrive. My dilemma was resolved by an unexpected sound. Vehicles approaching on the logging road. Hurrying to the window, I spotted 2 pickup trucks with Harrison Construction logos pulling into the clearing, men in hard hats emerging with surveying equipment. I quickly photographed the key documents with my phone, stashing the originals back in their hiding place before slipping out the rear door of the cabin. From the cover of trees, I observed as the men began marking areas along the riverbank with orange flags, clearly preliminary work for the dam construction. One man, appearing to be the supervisor, consulted a tablet while directing the others. I activated my phone's camera zoom to capture their activities as evidence of injunction violation. Grateful that the dense tree cover provided both concealment and prevented them from detecting my presence. After nearly an hour of observation, I retreated deeper into the woods to contact Vernon. "They're already here," I reported once I found sufficient signal. "Marking construction zones directly on trust property, in clear violation of the injunction." "Document everything," Vernon instructed. "I'm filing emergency motions based on this violation, but Richard will likely claim miscommunication with contractors or some other excuse to evade consequences." "There's more," I added, describing the environmental documents I'd discovered. "Definitive proof they knowingly suppressed information about endangered species." "That changes our strategic options significantly," Vernon noted. "Environmental violations carry much stricter penalties than simple property disputes. Can you transmit those documents securely?" The spotty cell service made large file transfers impossible. "Not from here. I'd need to return to town." "That's risky. If Richard's people see you." "I'll be careful," I promised. "But this evidence needs to get out before they can begin actual construction." Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of a helicopter approaching. Unusual in this remote area. From my vantage point among the trees, I watched as it landed in a clearing near where the Harrison construction trucks were parked. My blood ran cold as I recognized the figure who emerged, Richard himself, immaculately dressed despite the rustic surroundings, gesturing emphatically to the construction supervisor. My brother had come personally to oversee the permanent resolution of the property obstacle. This complicated matters significantly. Returning to town now risked a direct confrontation with Richard, but remaining meant potentially being discovered if his team conducted a thorough property inspection. As I weighed options, a third vehicle arrived, a black SUV with tinted windows. From it emerged 2 men in suits who looked distinctly out of place in the rural setting. They conferred briefly with Richard before one handed him what appeared to be legal documents. Through my phone's camera zoom, I captured images of the exchange, though couldn't make out the document contents. Richard's expression, however, showed clear satisfaction as he reviewed the papers. Whatever Richard had planned, it appeared to be proceeding to his satisfaction. I needed more information before deciding my next move. The ham radio in the cabin might offer a solution. If operational, it could potentially reach someone in town who could relay messages without requiring me to leave the property. Walter Jenkins had mentioned being a radio enthusiast. Perhaps he could help. Circling widely to avoid the construction area, I returned to the cabin during a moment when all personnel were down by the river. Inside, I quickly verified the radio was functional and, using the operating manual beside it, attempted to make contact on local frequencies. After several attempts, a response crackled through. "This is Riversdale Base, who's calling?" By remarkable coincidence, or perhaps my father's foresight, I had reached the local ranger station. Identifying myself only as a concerned citizen, I reported unusual construction activity near protected habitats along the Clearwater. "We've had no notifications of approved activity in that area," the ranger responded. "Can you describe exact location and nature of the work?" I provided details, emphasizing the environmental sensitivity of the area and mentioning the presence of Harrison construction vehicles. The ranger promised to dispatch someone to investigate, providing at least temporary disruption to Richard's plans. With that small victory, I turned my attention to the documents. The most critical pages needed to reach Vernon and Melissa's environmental group immediately. Using the cabin's solar-powered system, I photographed each page individually, creating smaller files that might transmit despite poor reception. As I worked. Voices approached the cabin. Richard and one of the suited men, their conversation becoming audible as they neared. The acquisition paperwork is being processed right now, the man was saying. By tomorrow morning, that trust property will be condemned through eminent domain for the public works project. Legal ownership becomes irrelevant at that point. Excellent, Richard replied. And the environmental permits? Finalized this morning. The regional administrator has been extremely cooperative. Their voices faded as they passed the cabin without entering, continuing toward the helicopter. Richard's strategy became clear. He was using political connections to have the property condemned and seized through government action, bypassing the normal legal process and rendering my ownership moot. This explained his confidence about the permanent resolution and accelerated timeline. By tomorrow, it would be too late to stop the process. I completed transmitting the document images to Vernon, along with an audio recording of Richard's conversation about eminent domain. Vernon's response was immediate. This changes everything. Eminent domain requires public interest justification. With evidence of environmental impact and corruption of the process, we can challenge on multiple fronts. He outlined an emergency strategy involving both legal filings and media exposure, coordinated with Melissa's environmental organization. We need to create enough public and regulatory attention that they can't proceed quietly, he explained. While Vernon mobilized legal resources, I faced a critical decision, whether to reveal myself to Richard or continue monitoring from hiding. Confrontation carried obvious risks, but might also provide an opportunity to directly challenge his actions with witnesses present. As I deliberated, the decision was made for me. The cabin door suddenly opened, and I found myself face to face with my brother. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Richard's expression shifted from shock to anger to a cold calculation I recognized all too well. I should have known, he said finally, stepping inside and closing the door. Dad always did have contingency plans, including protecting this river from your resort development, I replied, maintaining distance between us. Richard surveyed the cabin with disdain. All this effort to block progress. This development will bring jobs, tourism, tax revenue. But Dad could only see trees and fish. He saw a legacy worth preserving, I countered. Something more valuable than profit, margins. Spare me the environmental lecture. Richard's tone hardened. Whatever you think you're accomplishing here, it's already too late. By this time tomorrow, this property will be under government control for a public works project. Your trust ownership means nothing. Except I have recordings of you discussing bribing officials to make that happen. I held up my phone. And documentation proving you suppressed environmental impact studies showing endangered species in this watershed. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard's features. You're bluffing. Vernon already has everything. So does the Environmental Coalition opposing your development. And as of 20 minutes ago, so do federal regulators. Richard's face darkened with fury. You have no idea what you're interfering with. This project represents hundreds of millions in development. International investors who don't appreciate complications. Then, perhaps you should have considered the environmental regulations before promising them returns, I suggested. You think this is some noble stand? Richard's laugh held no humor. This is spite, Eleanor. You couldn't handle being marginalized. In Dad's company. In his will. So you're sabotaging everything out of revenge. His accusation struck closer to truth than I cared to admit. Was this partly about wounded pride and sibling rivalry? The question momentarily unbalanced me. Richard pressed his advantage. I'll make you an offer. Right now. One time only. Walk away. Drop all legal challenges. In return, I'll establish a trust for you. 20 million. No strings attached. More than enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. The offer was substantial. Far more than I needed financially. The temptation to end this exhausting battle flared briefly. Why would you offer that much unless you have much more to lose? I asked instead. Before Richard could respond, commotion erupted outside. Vehicles arriving, voices calling out official instructions. Through the window, I saw ranger trucks and what appeared to be federal environmental officials approaching the construction site. Richard's phone buzzed with incoming calls. After checking the screen, he fixed me with a cold stare. This isn't over. You've created delays, nothing more. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But enough for a proper investigation into both the environmental impact and the permit process. As Richard strode out to address the officials, I remained in the cabin, watching through the window as his carefully orchestrated plans began unraveling. Rangers were already documenting equipment placement and flagged areas, while environmental officers collected water samples from the river. My phone rang, Vernon with an update. The court has granted an emergency stay on any eminent domain, proceedings pending investigation of the approval process. And the EPA has issued a cease and desist order on all construction activity in the watershed area. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuine hope. Richard's momentum had been halted, at least temporarily. The evidence trail we'd assembled had created enough questions to pause his aggressive timeline. As I watched Richard gesticulating angrily at officials from my hidden vantage point, I recognized a fundamental truth that had eluded me until now. This battle wasn't simply about reclaiming my inheritance or exposing Richard's manipulation. It was about upholding the principles our father had built his legacy upon. Principles Richard had abandoned in pursuit of profit and power. Profit and power. The rural Vermont setting, so different from Boston's urban landscape, had provided unexpected clarity. Here, among mountains and rivers far older than human ambitions, the hollow nature of Richard's progress stood in stark relief. What remained uncertain was how far Richard would go to salvage his project, and what personal cost I would bear for standing against him. The temporary victory felt significant but fragile, much like the ecosystem we were fighting to protect. The following days brought an escalating series of moves and countermoves between Richard's team and our coalition. Environmental officials maintained the cease and desist order on the Vermont property, while Vernon successfully challenged the eminent domain proceedings by exposing the corruption behind the approval process. Richard, however, was far from defeated. He held a press conference portraying himself as a job-creating businessman, being obstructed by environmental extremists and a disgruntled family member. Local Vermont media gave him prominent coverage, particularly in publications his companies had financial interests in. Meanwhile, I remained at the cabin, working remotely with Vernon and Melissa's team to coordinate our response. Walter Jenkins and other local residents formed an impromptu community alliance, providing both support and local knowledge that proved invaluable. 5 days after the confrontation at the cabin, Vernon called with troubling news. Richard has filed a new legal motion claiming the trust property was purchased with misappropriated Harrison construction funds. He's alleging Dad diverted company resources inappropriately. That's absurd, I protested. Dad was meticulous about separating personal and business finances. Unfortunately, Richard has produced documentation showing wire transfers from company accounts to the trust. The court has frozen all trust assets pending investigation. This development was concerning, but not entirely surprising. Richard has access to all the company financial records. Could he have falsified the documentation? Possibly, but it will take forensic accounting to prove. In the meantime, the Vermont property remains protected by the environmental orders, but your access to trust funds is suspended. With my museum position eliminated and savings dwindling, this represented a significant financial blow. Richard was systematically attempting to exhaust my resources, forcing me to abandon the fight through financial attrition. There's more, Vernon continued. Hannah Morris, your father's nurse, was served with a lawsuit this morning for violating her NDA. Richard is seeking damages of $2 million. The vindictiveness of this move took my breath away. Hannah had risked her professional standing to share the truth about my father's treatment, and now faced financial ruin as a consequence. Can we help her? I asked. I've arranged representation through colleagues specializing in whistleblower protection, but it's another front in an expanding battle. Vernon sounded weary. Richard is targeting everyone who's helped you. This strategy was clearly designed to isolate me, making allies reconsider their support given the personal consequences. The question was how to counter these tactics. After ending the call with Vernon, I hiked to a ridge overlooking the valley, seeking perspective in the Vermont landscape. Below, the Clearwater River continued its eternal journey, indifferent to human conflicts over its fate. In the distance, construction equipment remained idle near the property boundary, a visual reminder of our temporary victory. The Environmental Alliance had established round-the-clock monitoring of the site, with volunteers documenting any activity. Richard's team maintained a presence but had ceased active work pending resolution of the legal challenges. As I contemplated our next steps, my phone signaled an incoming email from an unfamiliar address. The message contained only an image, a chess piece, specifically a white knight, placed on what appeared to be a conference room table I recognized from Harrison Construction headquarters. Minutes later, my phone rang. "Diane, did you receive it?" she asked without preamble. "The chess piece photo? What does it mean?" "It's from Margaret. Richard had her office cleaned out, but she managed to take something. A storage device your father had hidden in his chess set. Not the one in the study, but the travel set he kept in his desk." Diane's voice was hushed, suggesting she was somewhere she didn't want to be overheard. "She can't risk contacting you directly. Richard has her under surveillance." "What's on the storage device?" "Financial records. The real ones. Not the versions Richard has been presenting. Proof that company funds weren't used for the Vermont Property Trust. But more importantly, evidence of where the money for Richard's acquisitions actually came from." "Where?" "Investors with questionable backgrounds. Margaret says your father discovered connections to organizations under international sanctions and was preparing to sever those relationships before his health declined. This revelation added a new dimension to our conflict. Richard hadn't just manipulated our father's will. He had potentially entangled Harrison Construction with illegal financing sources. Where is Margaret now? Is she safe?" "Relatively. Richard doesn't know what she took, only that she might have removed items from her office. She's staying with family in New Hampshire." Diane paused. "Eleanor, there's something else. Board members are getting nervous about the Vermont situation. The negative publicity, the regulatory scrutiny, it's making them uncomfortable. 3 of them have requested a special meeting to discuss the project." "When?" "Tomorrow morning." Richard is scrambling to maintain control of the narrative. This represented the first crack in Richard's corporate authority. Board members questioning his judgment. If we could provide them with evidence of his ethical breaches and questionable financing sources, it might create leverage beyond the Vermont property dispute. "Can Margaret get the storage device to Vernon?" I asked. "Too risky. Richard has people watching both of them." But she suggested another option. "The Polaroid camera your father left you. The mysterious camera from the summer house safe." "What about it?" "It's not just a camera. The film cartridge has been modified to contain a micro SD card reader. Your father used it to transfer sensitive files without detection. Margaret thinks the chess piece storage device is designed to work with it." My father's elaborate precautions suddenly made sense. The seemingly obsolete Polaroid was actually a stealth data transfer system, allowing him to move sensitive information without digital traces. The question was how to reunite the camera with Margaret's chess piece storage device. "I need to get back to Boston," I realized. "Tonight. Richard believes you're still in Vermont. Use that advantage." Diane ended the call abruptly, presumably because someone had approached. I contacted Walter Jenkins, who agreed to maintain the appearance of my presence at the cabin through regular activity. Meanwhile, I made arrangements for a discreet return to Boston, avoiding main highways where Richard's security team might be watching. By midnight, I was approaching Boston from the north, having taken secondary roads through New Hampshire. Sullivan's team had arranged a safe house in Somerville, a modest apartment above a bookstore owned by a retired detective friend of Sullivan's. Margaret had left the chess piece storage device with the bookstore owner, who handed it over with a cryptic comment, "Documents aren't always what they appear to be." The small device, cleverly disguised as the base of a chess piece, contained no visible ports or connections. The Polaroid camera, which I'd fortunately brought from Vermont, appeared equally ordinary until closer inspection revealed subtle modifications to the film compartment. Following Margaret's instructions relayed through Diane, I placed the chess piece in a specific position within the modified compartment. A small LED blinked green, indicating successful connection. When connected to my laptop via a hidden USB port in the camera's battery compartment, the device mounted as an encrypted drive. The password, appropriately, was a combination of chess moves and standard notation, my father's favorite opening sequence. The contents were extraordinary. Years of financial records, both official versions and my father's private documentation of discrepancies. Most significant were files tracking the source of funds for Richard's aggressive expansion projects, revealing a complex network of shell companies leading back to investors with ties to sanctioned entities. My father had been investigating these connections before his health failed, documenting evidence that Richard had deliberately concealed the true source of financing from both him and the board. The most recent entries showed my father's growing concern about potential legal exposure for the company. The Vermont Property Trust hadn't been established merely to block Richard's environmentally damaging project. It was part of a larger strategy to protect company assets from potential regulatory penalties if the questionable financing was discovered. This evidence transformed our strategic options. Richard wasn't just fighting to protect a profitable development. He was desperately trying to prevent exposure of financial relationships that could trigger international sanctions investigations. I immediately contacted Vernon, who arranged an emergency conference call with Sullivan and Melissa. After reviewing the evidence, we formulated a multi-pronged approach. Vernon would prepare documentation for the board meeting, Sullivan would secure the evidence chain, and Melissa would coordinate with regulatory agencies regarding the environmental and potential sanctions violations. This is no longer just about your inheritance or even the Vermont property, Vernon noted. This is about potential violations of international sanctions law. The board needs to understand the exposure Richard has created. The question was how to present this evidence most effectively. Direct confrontation with Richard carried significant risks, both legal and personal. A more strategic approach would be working through sympathetic board members. Margaret mentioned 3 board members requesting the special meeting, I recalled. Do we know who they are or where they stand? Sullivan's team had been monitoring board communications. Thomas Reynolds, Victoria Chang, and Dr. William Abernathy, he reported. Reynolds and Chang have expressed environmental concerns about the Vermont project in private communications. Abernathy appears more concerned about regulatory compliance generally. I recognized all 3 names, respected business leaders who had worked with my father for years. They represented the old guard of Harrison Construction, professionals who valued the company's reputation for ethical practices. I know them, I confirmed. Dad trusted them. They're not in Richard's inner circle. We decided that Vernon would approach Reynolds confidentially before the board meeting, providing enough evidence to raise serious concerns without overwhelming him with details. This would create an advocate within the meeting itself, someone prepared to ask difficult questions. While this plan took shape, Margaret provided additional intelligence through Diane. Richard had hired a crisis management firm and was preparing to announce a redesigned Vermont project that supposedly addressed environmental concerns while still proceeding with development. This announcement, scheduled for after the board meeting, suggested Richard remained confident in his ability to manage both the board and public perception. Our window for intervention was narrowing. By dawn, Vernon had prepared a comprehensive briefing for Reynolds, who agreed to meet him for breakfast before the board meeting. I remained at the safe house, coordinating communications and preparing for various contingencies. At 9:30 a.m., Vernon texted confirmation that Reynolds had received our evidence and appeared deeply concerned. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. What followed were perhaps the longest hours of the entire ordeal. With no direct presence in the meeting, we could only wait for updates from Vernon's contact within Harrison Construction headquarters. At 11:45 a.m., Diane called. The meeting's still going. Richard tried to limit discussion of Vermont to 10 minutes, but Reynolds opened with questions about financing sources. It spiraled from there. How is Richard responding? Not well. He accused Reynolds of being manipulated by outside interests. Then Chang asked specifically about the sanctioned entities documentation. Richard demanded to know where these fabricated documents came from. Has my name come up? Not directly. They're focusing on the financial and legal exposure rather than the family dispute. Diane paused. Eleanor, Richard looks rattled for the first time since this all began. He wasn't prepared for this level of specific questioning. This was encouraging news, suggesting the board was taking the evidence seriously rather than dismissing it as part of a family feud. At 1:30 p.m., Vernon called with an update. The board has called a recess until tomorrow morning. They've requested independent verification of the financial documentation and legal opinions regarding potential sanctions exposure. How did Richard leave it? Defensive, but maintaining the position that all financing sources were properly vetted. He's alternating between attacking the evidence as fabricated and claiming he was unaware of any problematic connections. This division in Richard's response was telling. If the evidence was fabricated, he wouldn't need to claim ignorance of the connections it revealed. What happens now? I asked. The board has tasked their outside counsel with reviewing everything overnight. Richard is scrambling to control the narrative, but several members appeared deeply concerned about potential regulatory and legal exposure. For the first time, Richard faced opposition from within his power structure. Board members whose primary loyalty was to the company rather than to him personally. This shift created leverage we hadn't previously had. Late that afternoon, Sullivan reported unusual activity at Harrison Construction headquarters. Executives coming and going outside normal hours. Security personnel conducting what appeared to be searches of certain offices. Richard's looking for the source of the leak, Sullivan concluded. He knows someone provided those documents to the board. This raised concerns about both Margaret and Diane, who remained vulnerable to discovery. I contacted Diane, who confirmed that tension within the building was palpable. Richard has IT teams reviewing all digital communications, she reported. He's convinced someone internally provided the board with the documentation. Are you at risk? Possibly. I've been careful, but Richard is becoming increasingly suspicious of everyone. Diane sounded genuinely afraid for the first time. He had security escort 2 executives from the finance department out this afternoon. No explanation given. I advised her to leave the building at the first opportunity and not return until the situation stabilized. She agreed, but indicated she wanted to monitor the developing situation for as long as possible. By evening, a new complication emerged. Richard had scheduled a press conference for 9 a.m. the following morning, before the board's reconvened meeting. According to Diane, he planned to announce a strategic reorganization of the company's leadership structure. He's going to try to consolidate control before the board can act, Vernon concluded when I shared this information. Possibly announcing new board appointments loyal to him, or structural changes that dilute the current board's authority. We needed to counter this move, but our options were limited given Richard's control of the company's public communications channels. After consulting with Sullivan and Melissa, we settled on a high-risk strategy. I would attend Richard's press conference in person. Your presence alone will disrupt his narrative, Vernon reasoned. It transforms a corporate announcement into a visible family confrontation, which will attract media attention to the underlying disputes. Sullivan arranged for a security detail given concerns about Richard's increasing desperation. Melissa's environmental coalition agreed to have representatives present as well, creating additional media interest. As midnight approached, I reviewed our strategy one final time with the team. We had evidence of Richard's ethical breaches and questionable financing, board members beginning to question his leadership, and a plan to disrupt his attempt to seize narrative control. For the first time since this ordeal began, we had momentum. What I couldn't anticipate was how Richard would respond to this shifting dynamic, or what desperate measures he might take to maintain control as his carefully constructed facade began crumbling. As I finally drifted towards sleep in the safe house, my thoughts returned to my father. Had he anticipated this conflict all along? His elaborate precautions, the hidden documents, the secret trust, the modified camera, suggested he had known Richard might attempt to seize complete control and had created safeguards against that possibility. Wondered what he would think of the path I'd chosen. Not simple acceptance of disinheritance, not quiet retreat with the secret trust funds, but direct confrontation with the brother who had betrayed both his daughter and his principles. Tomorrow would bring the most public phase of our conflict, with consequences not just for my inheritance, but for the future of Harrison Construction itself. The company my father had built, the legacy he had entrusted to both his children, hung in the balance. The Harrison Construction headquarters lobby buzzed with unusual activity for 8:30 a.m. Media representatives adjusted equipment while public relations staff directed traffic with practiced efficiency. Large displays featured architectural renderings of the proposed Lighthouse Mountain Resort, Richard's Vermont project reimagined with superficial environmental modifications. I entered through the main doors, Sullivan's security detail flanking me discreetly. The reaction was immediate. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turned, and a ripple of recognition spread through the assembled crowd. A PR assistant approached, professional smile faltering as she recognized me. Ms. Harrison, we weren't expecting you. This is a closed corporate announcement. I'm still a Harrison, I replied calmly. And I believe this announcement concerns matters directly affecting my interests. Her expression betrayed uncertainty. Clearly, no contingency plan existed for my appearance. Let me check with Mr. Harrison's team. As she hurried away, I surveyed the room. Media presence was substantial. Local Boston outlets plus national business publications. Melissa's Environmental Coalition representatives had positioned themselves strategically near presentation displays, ready to offer alternative perspectives to reporters. Vernon had advised maintaining a dignified, composed presence. Let Richard be the one to lose composure publicly, he'd suggested. This approach aligned with my natural temperament, though the emotional turmoil beneath my calm exterior was profound. The PR assistant returned with Richard's chief of staff, Howard Benson, a recent hire known for aggressive corporate communication strategies. Eleanor, this is surprising, Benson stated flatly. This presentation concerns corporate restructuring announcements, not family matters. Given that the corporate restructuring likely impacts Harrison assets currently under legal dispute, I believe I have standing to attend, I responded, loud enough for nearby reporters to overhear. Benson assessed the situation quickly, clearly calculating whether forcibly removing me would create worse optics than allowing my presence. You may observe from the back, he conceded reluctantly. But this is not a forum for personal grievances. As we negotiated this uneasy truce, commotion near the elevators announced Richard's arrival. My brother emerged, surrounded by executives, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that couldn't quite disguise the tension in his posture and the shadows beneath his eyes. His step faltered momentarily when he spotted me, genuine shock breaking through his practiced facade before he recovered, whispering urgently to Benson. Their hurried conference concluded with Richard straightening his tie and approaching the podium, while Benson directed security personnel to positions closer to where I stood. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice steady despite the unexpected complication of my presence. "Thank you for joining us for this important announcement regarding Harrison Construction's future direction." I maintained my position at the back of the room, a silent reminder of the family conflict underpinning the corporate narrative Richard was attempting to control. Harrison Construction has always evolved to meet changing market conditions, he continued. Today, I'm announcing strategic leadership adjustments to position us for continued growth and innovation. Richard outlined a restructuring that effectively consolidated his control, creating a new executive committee with himself as chairman, diluting the board's oversight authority through technical amendments to corporate bylaws. The maneuver was legally questionable but cleverly constructed to create facts on the ground before opposition could mobilize. As he spoke, I noticed Diane slip into the room, positioning herself near a side exit. Our eyes met briefly, her expression conveying silent support amid the corporate theater unfolding before us. When Richard shifted to discussing the Vermont development, characterizing opposition as misunderstandings based on incomplete information, Melissa's environmental representatives strategically raised questions about specific watershed impacts, creating visible discomfort as Richard offered vague platitudes rather than substantive responses. The press conference's carefully managed narrative began fraying further when a business reporter asked about rumors of board members raising concerns about project financing. Richard's smile tightened. Harrison Construction maintains the highest standards of financial governance. Any questions raised have been fully addressed to the board's satisfaction. This was a significant overstatement given the board's recessed meeting and ongoing investigation. But before I could determine how to challenge it appropriately, the lobby doors opened again. Thomas Reynolds, the senior board member Vernon had briefed, entered with two other board members. Their unexpected appearance created immediate tension, with Richard visibly struggling to maintain his composure. "Mr. Reynolds," Richard acknowledged stiffly. "We weren't expecting board representation at this announcement." "Clearly," Reynolds replied, his tone measured but unmistakably cold. "Which is concerning given that the board has not approved the restructuring you're announcing." A murmur ran through the assembled media as this public contradiction of Richard's authority registered. Reporters began furiously taking notes and signaling camera operators. Richard attempted to salvage the situation. "Perhaps we should discuss board protocols privately rather than. I believe transparency is appropriate given the circumstances," Reynolds interrupted. The board recessed yesterday specifically to investigate serious concerns about certain financing arrangements and regulatory compliance issues. No organizational changes have been authorized during this review period. The confrontation had now fully escaped Richard's control, evolving into precisely the public exposure of governance disputes we had hoped to achieve. I remained strategically silent, allowing the internal corporate conflict to unfold without the complication of family dynamics. Richard signaled to Benson, who quickly announced, "We'll be taking a brief pause in the presentation. Please enjoy refreshments in the adjacent reception area." As staff attempted to herd media representatives toward the reception room, I seized the opportunity to approach Reynolds, introducing myself formally despite our previous acquaintance through my father. "Ms. Harrison," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I suspected we might encounter each other today." "I appreciate the board's willingness to examine the evidence objectively," I responded quietly. "Your father valued integrity above all else in business," Reynolds replied. "The documentation we've reviewed raises questions that can't be ignored, regardless of family dynamics." Our conversation was interrupted by Richard approaching with security personnel. "This is a private corporate matter now, Eleanor. Your presence is neither required nor welcome." Reynolds straightened, his considerable height allowing him to look down at Richard. "Actually, given the nature of the allegations under review and Ms. Harrison's potential standing in related matters, I believe her perspective may be quite relevant to our deliberations." This unexpected support from a respected board member visibly unsettled Richard. The power dynamics were shifting palpably, his authority eroding in real time before a room full of media witnesses. "The board reconvenes in 30 minutes, Reynolds continued. "I'm formally inviting Ms. Harrison to present relevant information directly, rather than through intermediaries." Richard's face flushed with barely contained fury. "That's completely unprecedented and inappropriate. So are the circumstances we find ourselves in," Reynolds countered calmly. "Ninth floor boardroom, 30 minutes." He nodded to me before departing with his fellow board members. Left facing Richard with media hovering just beyond earshot, I maintained the composed demeanor. Vernon had advised despite the turbulent emotions beneath the surface. "You've miscalculated badly," Richard said, voice low and dangerous. "Whatever temporary advantage you think you've gained, remember that I still control this company." "Do you?" I questioned softly. The board seems increasingly unconvinced. "They have no idea who they're dealing with." The threat in his tone was unmistakable. "Neither do you." As Richard turned to leave, I added, "Dad always said your greatest weakness was assuming everyone else shared your lack of principles." He froze momentarily before continuing toward the executive elevators, shoulders rigid with tension. Vernon arrived moments later, having monitored the situation remotely. "That couldn't have gone better from our perspective," he observed. Richard's attempt to consolidate power publicly backfired spectacularly. Reynolds's invitation to the board meeting changes our timeline significantly, I noted. "It's an extraordinary opportunity," Vernon agreed, "but also carries risks. Richard will be present, potentially hostile, and still wields considerable influence with some board members." We spent the next 20 minutes refining our presentation strategy, focusing on the most compelling evidence of financial irregularities and environmental malfeasance, without overtly addressing the will manipulation or family conflict. As we prepared to head to the boardroom, Diane approached urgently. "Richard is calling in reinforcements," she warned. "He's contacted 2 board members currently traveling internationally, attempting to arrange remote participation. Both have generally supported his agenda. This development could potentially rebalance voting power if critical decisions were required today." Vernon made notes to adjust our strategy accordingly, while Sullivan arranged for his team to maintain presence in the lobby, monitoring for additional developments. The 9th floor executive suite presented a stark contrast to the public lobby. Hushed, elegant, with historical photographs documenting the company's 70-year evolution. Many featured my father and grandfather, their expressions serious yet marked by genuine integrity that seemed increasingly absent from the current leadership. The boardroom itself, where I had occasionally joined my father for family-related announcements, felt simultaneously familiar and alienating. 14 chairs surrounded a massive table crafted from a single walnut tree, a commission my grandfather had arranged when establishing company headquarters. Board members were already assembling as we entered. Richard sat at the head of the Table, position of authority unchanged despite the morning's challenges to his decision-making. His expression remained carefully neutral as we took seats at the opposite end. Reynolds called the meeting to order with formal efficiency. Before addressing the proposed restructuring announced this morning, we have outstanding questions from yesterday regarding project financing and regulatory compliance. Given Ms. Harrison's relevant information, I've invited her to address these specific matters directly. Richard immediately objected. Ms. Harrison is currently engaged in litigation against both myself and potentially the company. Her participation represents a clear conflict of interest. Victoria Chang, the board member Sullivan had identified as environmentally concerned, spoke up. Given that the issues under examination potentially resulted from conflicts of interest within executive leadership, that objection seems rather selective, Richard. This subtle rebuke from a normally reserved board member suggested shifting allegiances that favored our position. With Reynolds' permission, I began presenting the evidence we had assembled. For the next 40 minutes, I methodically outlined the documentation showing questionable financing sources for the Vermont development, environmental reports that had been suppressed, and the pattern of regulatory manipulation. Vernon occasionally provided legal context, but largely I presented the case myself, drawing on both my father's hidden records and information gathered through our investigation. Throughout the presentation, Richard's expression darkened progressively, his objections becoming increasingly procedural rather than substantive as the weight of evidence mounted. Board members' questions revealed growing concern about potential legal exposure and reputational damage. The most dramatic moment came when I presented documentation showing Richard had knowingly accepted financing from entities associated with sanctioned international interests, a potential violation of federal regulations that could trigger significant penalties. These transactions were properly vetted through standard procedures, Richard insisted, though his confident tone had diminished noticeably. Then you can provide the compliance certification documentation? Dr. Abernathy asked, his academic precision cutting through Richard's generalities. Of course. I'll have the finance department prepare those records. Richard's slight hesitation betrayed the likelihood that no such documentation existed. As the presentation concluded, Reynolds thanked me for the information before requesting that both Richard and I step out temporarily to allow the board to deliberate privately. In the adjacent conference room, Richard and I sat in tense silence for several minutes before he finally spoke. "You have no idea the forces you're interfering with," he said quietly. "This goes beyond family inheritance or environmental concerns. There are commitments to people who don't accept failure." The implicit threat was concerning but also revealing. Richard appeared genuinely afraid of consequences beyond legal or corporate penalties. "Then perhaps you should have considered those complications before making such commitments," I suggested. "Always so righteous," he replied bitterly. "Dad's perfect daughter, keeper of family values. You have no concept of what it takes to grow a company in today's environment." "I understand the difference between growth and corruption," I countered. "Dad built something that lasted because people trusted his integrity. You're destroying that legacy for short-term gain." Our conversation was interrupted by Benson arriving with news. The board had requested Richard's return alone. This procedural detail suggested serious deliberations about leadership were underway. Excluding the subject of those discussions was standard governance practice. Left alone, I contacted Sullivan for updates from the lobby, where media representatives continued gathering as word spread about the unexpected board meeting and morning confrontation. After approximately an hour, during which various executives were summoned briefly to the boardroom, Vernon was invited to join the proceedings. His prolonged absence suggested complex legal discussions regarding options and obligations. When he finally returned, his expression conveyed cautious optimism. "The board has reached several preliminary determinations," he reported. "They've suspended the Vermont development pending comprehensive environmental and financial review, frozen certain project accounts for forensic examination, and most significantly, placed Richard on administrative leave while an independent investigation proceeds." This represented a seismic shift in corporate governance, the board asserting authority over Richard's leadership in unprecedented fashion. While not a complete victory, it created space for proper examination of the evidence we had presented. "What happens next?" I asked. "The board has appointed an interim executive committee, with Reynolds as acting chairman. They've also directed outside counsel to review the trust property documentation and potentially seek settlement of those claims separate from other matters. As we discussed implications, Diane texted an update from inside. Richard had left the boardroom, looking shell-shocked, and gone directly to his office with Benson. The board formally adjourned an hour later, with Reynolds emerging to briefly address waiting media. His carefully worded statement confirmed leadership changes and review processes without directly addressing family disputes or specific allegations. As board members dispersed, several, including Reynolds, acknowledged me with respectful nods, a subtle but meaningful recognition that transcended the family conflict narrative Richard had tried to establish. When we finally left the building that evening, the spring sunset cast long shadows across Boston's financial district. The day's events had fundamentally altered the trajectory of our conflict, shifting from private family dispute to corporate governance crisis. The board's actions create leverage for resolving both the inheritance and environmental issues, Vernon observed as we walked toward his car. Richard's authority has been significantly compromised. Yet despite this apparent victory, I felt strangely hollow. The public confrontation, while necessary, had permanently altered family relationships in ways that could never be fully repaired. The satisfaction of exposing Richard's manipulation was tempered by awareness of what had been irretrievably lost. What remained uncertain was how Richard would respond to this public humiliation and challenge to his authority. A man willing to manipulate his dying father and disinherit his sister would unlikely accept defeat gracefully, particularly with mysterious commitments to concerning outside interests. As Sullivan's security team escorted us from the building, I glimpsed Richard watching from his office window. His expression unreadable at that distance, but his continued presence a reminder that our conflict was far from concluded. The battle had shifted in our favor, but the war for my father's legacy, both corporate and personal, had entered a new and potentially more dangerous phase. The board's decision to place Richard on administrative leave created a temporary power vacuum at Harrison Construction. Over the following week, interim leadership struggled to maintain operational stability, while simultaneously managing the fallout from public scrutiny of the Vermont development and associated financing questions. I remained in Boston, working closely with Vernon to leverage the shifting corporate dynamics toward resolution of both the inheritance dispute and environmental concerns. The board, now functioning with greater independence, proved more receptive to examining the full context of events leading to the current crisis. Thomas Reynolds, as acting chairman, arranged a private meeting at Vernon's office to discuss potential pathways forward. The board's primary responsibility is to the company's long-term stability and reputation, he explained, his manner forthright but not unkind. The evidence you've presented raises serious concerns about Richard's judgment and potentially his legal compliance. However, a prolonged public battle damages everyone involved, including the Harrison family legacy your father valued highly. I understand the board's position, I acknowledged. My goal has never been to damage the company, only to address specific wrongs. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. Which is why I believe we may have common ground for resolution. The board is prepared to support independent investigation of the will's validity, separate from corporate governance matters. If evidence supports your claims of manipulation during your father's illness, appropriate adjustments to inheritance distributions could be implemented without further litigation. This represented significant progress, formal recognition that my inheritance claims merited serious consideration rather than dismissal as family grievances. And the Vermont property? I inquired. The environmental reviews have already confirmed significant issues with the proposed development. The board has voted to suspend the project indefinitely and explore alternative uses for properties already acquired. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. Your trust property remains key to any future considerations in that area. The board would be interested in discussing conservation easements that would both protect the watershed and provide tax advantages to all parties. This approach aligned perfectly with my father's environmental values while potentially creating financial benefits that made the solution palatable to corporate interests. A balanced outcome that served multiple objectives. These terms seem reasonable, I agreed cautiously. But Richard remains a significant shareholder and influence, even while on administrative leave. Would he accept such arrangements? Reynolds' expression darkened slightly. Richard's options are increasingly limited. The The financial investigation has uncovered troubling patterns beyond what you initially presented. There may be regulatory consequences regardless of internal resolutions. His careful phrasing suggested discoveries of potentially criminal financial improprieties, a development that could fundamentally alter Richard's future beyond mere corporate governance changes. As we concluded this promising discussion, my phone buzzed with an urgent message from Sullivan. Security breach at Safe House. Location compromised. Immediate relocation required. A chill ran through me as implications registered. Despite his suspended status, Richard clearly maintained access to resources willing to cross legal boundaries. The escalation to physical security threats represented a dangerous new phase in our conflict. Sullivan arranged immediate transfer to a different secure location. A waterfront condominium owned by a former client, equipped with advanced security systems and limited access points. As we completed this hurried relocation, Diane called with alarming news. Richard's office has been cleared out, she reported. Not by company personnel. His own security team removed everything overnight. And he's not responding to board communications. He's going off-grid, Sullivan concluded when I shared this information, preparing either to flee potential consequences or to take more aggressive action from outside normal channels. This development accelerated our timeline significantly. Vernon filed emergency motions to freeze additional assets and formally document evidence already gathered, while Sullivan's team implemented enhanced security protocols around key personnel, including Margaret, Hannah, and myself. That evening, as I reviewed documentation for upcoming depositions, an email arrived from an anonymous address. The message contained only an image. A black king chess piece toppled on its side, the universal symbol of checkmate and surrender. Minutes later, my phone rang. Richard's private number. After brief hesitation, I answered. "Richard, we need to talk," he stated without preamble. "Not through lawyers or board members. Just you and me. One final conversation." His tone lacked the arrogance I'd grown accustomed to, replaced by something resembling resignation. "Why would I agree to that after what's happened?" I asked. "Because despite everything, we're still family. And because I'm offering a clean resolution, no more legal battles, no more investigations, a simple split of assets as Dad originally intended." The sudden reversal triggered immediate suspicion. "What's changed?" A humorless laugh. "Everything. The board's financial investigation has gone places I can't control. International partners are displeased with the attention. I need to establish distance quickly." The subtext was clear. Richard faced pressure from the questionable financing sources he'd engaged with, entities unlikely to accept public scrutiny gracefully. "I'm prepared to sign full reversion to original will terms, transfer the Vermont property to Environmental Trust permanently, and step away from Harrison Construction entirely," he continued. "In exchange, certain financial investigations would be redirected away from specific international relationships. That's not entirely within my power to arrange," I noted. "More than you might think, given the board's current receptiveness to your position. Reynolds in particular seems to value your perspective considerably." This assessment wasn't wrong. The board chairman had demonstrated remarkable willingness to consider my input on various matters. Whether this influence extended to redirecting financial investigations remained questionable, but Richard clearly believed it might. "Why should I trust any offer from you at this point?" I asked directly. "Because self-preservation has always been my primary motivation," Richard replied with unexpected candor. "Fighting you further damages my position rather than improving it. I'm cutting losses and salvaging what remains." The pragmatic calculation behind this statement actually enhanced its credibility. Richard had always been motivated by practical advantage rather than principle. "Where and when?" I asked, still deeply skeptical but recognizing potential value in hearing him out. "The summer house. Tomorrow afternoon. Just us. No lawyers, no security teams." The location choice seemed symbolic, returning to the site of childhood memories and recent discoveries. "I'll consider it," I responded, unwilling to commit immediately. "Don't consider too long. This offer has a short expiration period." The call ended abruptly, leaving me with profound concerns about both Richard's proposal and his mental state. I immediately contacted Sullivan and Vernon, sharing details of the conversation and seeking their assessment. "It's almost certainly a trap," Sullivan stated bluntly. "His financial position may indeed be deteriorating, but the request for isolation at a remote location raises obvious security concerns." Vernon's analysis was more nuanced. "There's potential legal advantage in direct conversation if properly documented. However, proceeding without security measures would be extraordinarily reckless given recent developments." After extensive discussion, we developed a compromise approach. I would meet Richard at the summer house, but with Sullivan's team establishing unobtrusive surveillance of the property perimeter and Vernon on standby nearby. Additionally, I would wear recording equipment to document any agreements or admissions. "If he's genuine about resolution, our presence won't matter," Sullivan reasoned. "If he's planning something else, the precautions are essential." The following day dawned with ominous weather. Dark clouds gathering over Boston Harbor as I prepared for the journey north. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. This confrontation had been brewing since the moment of my disinheritance. A storm finally reaching its climax. Sullivan's team departed ahead, establishing positions around the property while remaining out of sight. Vernon followed separately, positioning himself in the nearby town where he could respond quickly if needed. As I drove north along familiar coastal roads, memories of earlier trips to the summer house flooded back. Childhood vacations, teenage rebellions, and more recent discoveries of my father's hidden contingency plans. The property represented both innocence lost and wisdom painfully gained. The summer house appeared unchanged externally when I arrived. Weathered cedar shingles, blue-gray trim, wide porch facing the Atlantic. Richard's Tesla was parked in the circular drive, confirmation that he had indeed arrived ahead of me. I sat in my car momentarily, gathering resolve for whatever awaited inside. Sullivan's team had confirmed the property was clear of additional personnel. If Richard had planned an ambush, he was executing it alone. The front door stood slightly ajar when I approached, an invitation I accepted with measured caution. Inside, the familiar scent of old wood and sea air greeted me, along with the unexpected sound of classical music. Bach's cello suites, my father's favorite weekend soundtrack. Richard sat in our father's old leather chair by the picture window, gazing out at the turbulent Atlantic. A decanter of scotch and 2 glasses rested on the side table, one already partially emptied. Without turning, he sensed my presence. "Do you remember the summer we built that ridiculous treehouse?" he asked, voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "Dad could have hired professionals, but he insisted we do it ourselves. Spent 3 weekends teaching us proper construction techniques." It collapsed 2 months later during that August storm, I recalled, remaining near the doorway. But he made us rebuild it, stronger than before. Richard finally turned toward me. He always believed in second chances, just not in shortcuts. The man before me bore little resemblance to the polished corporate executive from recent confrontations. Unshaven, eyes bloodshot, he projected exhaustion and something I'd rarely witnessed in him: vulnerability. "You said you wanted to resolve things," I prompted, unwilling to be drawn into nostalgic distraction. Richard gestured to the adjacent chair, our mother's favorite reading spot. "I've signed the paperwork Vernon prepared. Full recognition of the original will terms, transfer of Vermont properties to Permanent Conservation Trust, resignation from Harrison Construction." Documents spread across the coffee table confirmed his statement. The comprehensive resolution package Vernon had drafted but never expected Richard to accept. "Why the sudden surrender?" I asked, still standing despite his invitation to sit. "Surrender," he repeated with a bitter smile. "An appropriate term. You've positioned the pieces brilliantly, Eleanor. The board investigation uncovered more than even you anticipated. Federal regulators have been quietly informed. My options evaporated rather suddenly. The questionable financing sources? Let's just say certain international partners don't appreciate regulatory attention. They've made it clear that my continued association creates uncomfortable exposure for them. He took another sip of scotch. "I have approximately 48 hours to establish complete separation from those entanglements before their displeasure becomes more direct." The implication was troubling but explained his sudden willingness to concede everything. Richard faced threats beyond legal consequences. Physical dangers from criminal elements he'd entangled himself with. "You're planning to disappear," I realized. "New identity, new location, already arranged." He finally met my gaze directly. Hence the urgency of resolving family matters conclusively before I go. I studied him carefully, searching for signs of deception, but finding only resignation. "You could have simply signed the documents and sent them to Vernon. Why insist on meeting here?" Richard glanced around the room, attention lingering on family photographs adorning the walls. "I wanted to see it one last time. And..." He hesitated. To say something without lawyers present. I remained silent, waiting. I was wrong. The admission emerged with visible difficulty. Not just legally or ethically. I was wrong about what Dad wanted for the company, for the family. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that growth and success were the only meaningful metrics, that his environmental principles and community values were outdated constraints. This unexpected moment of self-reflection caught me off guard. Dad never opposed growth or success. He just believed they shouldn't come at the expense of integrity. A distinction I deliberately blurred until I could no longer recognize it. Richard picked up a framed photograph. Our family on the beach below the house, taken perhaps 15 years earlier. "Do you hate me, Eleanor?" The question hung between us, forcing me to examine my own feelings beyond the strategy and legal positioning of recent weeks. "I've hated what you did," I answered carefully. "The manipulation, the betrayal, the willingness to destroy what Dad built. But hating you entirely would require forgetting the brother who taught me to sail in that bay, who helped me with calculus homework, who stood beside me at Mom's funeral." Richard placed the photograph carefully back on the table. "I'm not asking forgiveness. Some actions don't warrant that. But I wanted you to know that in the end, I recognized what I had become. There's value in that awareness, even if it came too late." For the first time since this ordeal began, I took the seat opposite him. Not in acceptance of his justifications, but in recognition of the complexity beneath our conflict. The brother who had betrayed me so comprehensively was also the brother I had once admired, the complicated reality more painful than simple villainy would have been. "What will happen to you?" I asked. "Better you don't know specifics. New name, new history, enough financial resources transferred through untraceable channels to start over." He glanced at his watch. "A plane waiting at a private airfield. After that, Elena Harrison's brother effectively ceases to exist." We sat in silence for several minutes, the box suites providing atmospheric continuity to a discontinuous reality. Outside, waves crashed against the rocky shore below, constant, indifferent to human dramas unfolding above. "There's one more thing," Richard said eventually, retrieving an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Dad left this with his private attorney, with instructions to deliver it if the family ever fractured irreparably. The attorney contacted me yesterday, apparently following news coverage of recent events. He handed me the sealed envelope, my name written in our father's distinctive handwriting across the front. I haven't opened it," Richard assured me. "Whatever message he left, it's yours alone now." As I accepted this final communication from beyond, Richard stood and straightened his jacket, a habitual gesture from board meetings and press conferences that seemed oddly formal in the summer house setting. "I should go. Commercial flights might be monitored, but private aviation still offers certain anonymities." He moved toward the door, then hesitated. "The company has good people. Reynolds, Chang, the others. With you involved, perhaps they'll find their way back to Dad's vision. Is that what you want?" I asked, genuinely curious about his final perspective on the enterprise he'd fought so aggressively to control. What I want stopped mattering the moment I chose expedience over principle. He offered a sad smile. "Maybe it's fitting that you're the one who remains to carry the Harrison name forward. You were always the better custodian of what it represented." With that acknowledgement, perhaps the most honest statement he'd made in years, Richard walked out the door and out of my life. Through the window, I watched him drive away, the Tesla disappearing around the coastal bend for the final time. Alone in the summer house filled with generational memories, I opened my father's letter. His familiar handwriting covered several pages, reflections on family legacy, business philosophy, and finally, a passage that brought unexpected tears. If you're reading this, Eleanor, then divisions I feared have come to pass. Remember that families, like businesses, can weather storms if their foundations are sound. Whatever Richard has done, whatever pain has been inflicted, know that your strength has always been in rebuilding rather than retribution. The Harrison name continues through you now, not just in legal documents, but in values and vision. That continuation matters more than any inheritance of mere assets. As evening approached, I contacted Vernon and Sullivan, confirming the signed agreements and Richard's departure. Legal machinery would process the formal resolutions, restoring my inheritance and establishing the environmental protections for the Vermont property. Harrison Construction would begin its recovery under interim leadership, with board members receptive to maintaining my father's founding principles. Standing on the porch overlooking the darkening Atlantic, I recognized this moment as both ending and beginning, the conclusion of a battle for justice, and the commencement of responsibility for the legacy I had fought to reclaim. The path forward would require balancing business necessities with ethical imperatives, just as my father had navigated for decades. It would mean transforming bitter victory into constructive renewal, personal vindication into corporate restoration. As stars emerged above the ocean horizon, I made silent peace with the tumultuous journey of recent months. The inheritance I had truly gained wasn't measured in property deeds or bank balances, but in deeper understanding of both family complexities and personal capacity for resilience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, board meetings, legal formalities, media, inquiries. But tonight, surrounded by the tangible reminders of family history, I allowed myself to simply exist in the resolution, neither celebrating victory nor mourning what had been irretrievably lost. Some inheritances, after all, transcend what can be documented in wills or contested in courtrooms. Those inheritances, values, memories, purpose, had survived intact, perhaps even strengthened through the crucible of conflict. And in that realization, I found something unexpected among the legal victories and financial restorations, a quiet sense of wholeness that felt, finally, like moving forward. 3 months after the confrontation at the summer house, I stood on the Vermont property that had become central to our family conflict. Summer had transformed the landscape. Verdant forests surrounded the meandering Clearwater River, wildflowers carpeted meadows, and birdsong provided natural orchestration to the scene. Margaret stood beside me, clipboard in hand, as we finalized details for the Conservation Trust inauguration scheduled for the following week. In the months since Richard's departure, she had become an invaluable partner in rebuilding both family and business relationships. The environmental assessment team confirms this ecosystem supports 17 threatened species, she noted, reviewing their latest report. The conservation easement will protect over 2,500 acres when combined with adjacent properties we've acquired. Dad would have loved this, I reflected, watching sunlight dance across the river's surface. This was always what he envisioned for Harrison Land Holdings. Development in harmony with preservation. The transformation of the failed lighthouse, mountain resort into the Harrison Watershed Preserve represented more than environmental conservation. It symbolized the shift in corporate values I had championed since assuming a leadership role at Harrison Construction. Richard had indeed disappeared completely. Occasional intelligence reports suggested residence in Southeast Asia under an assumed identity, though details remained deliberately vague. The international partners whose displeasure he had feared apparently considered accounts settled with his permanent departure and the discreet resolution of financial entanglements. The company had weathered the transition with remarkable resilience. After a brief period of interim leadership, the board had formally invited me to serve as executive chairperson, not CEO, as I had maintained my museum curatorial work part-time. Unwilling to surrender completely the professional identity I had built independently, this hybrid arrangement created space for professional management while ensuring family values remained central to corporate governance. Reynolds had continued as board chairman, providing continuity and institutional memory during the rebuilding period. The governor's office confirmed attendance at the dedication, Margaret continued, checking another item on her list. A long, with representatives from 3 environmental organizations and the regional EPA director. The political and regulatory landscape had shifted dramatically since evidence of corruption in the permitting process had emerged. New oversight procedures had been implemented, with Harrison Construction ironically emerging as a corporate model for environmental compliance. A remarkable rehabilitation of reputation over relatively short time. And the local community representatives? I asked, knowing their participation mattered more than government officials to the preserve's long-term success. Walter Jenkins will speak on behalf of local stakeholders. The Community Advisory Board is finalized. 7 members representing agriculture, recreation, education, and conservation interests. Margaret smiled. They're already planning educational programs for regional schools. This collaborative approach represented the most significant departure from Richard's development vision. Rather than imposing corporate will on the community, we had engaged local wisdom in determining how best to balance human needs with environmental protection. My phone chimed with a message from Diane, now serving as Chief Compliance Officer. For Harrison Construction, her legal expertise redirected toward ensuring ethical business practices rather than facilitating questionable ones. Vernon's team has finalized the family trust restructuring, she reported when I returned her call. The foundation documentation is ready for your review before Friday's meeting. The Harrison Family Foundation, established with a significant portion of my restored inheritance, would focus on environmental education and community development throughout New England. The foundation structure provided tax advantages while creating institutional continuity for the values I sought to perpetuate beyond personal involvement. After concluding business discussions, I hiked along the river trail to the cabin that had played such a pivotal role in our family drama. I had maintained it largely unchanged, a reminder of both crisis and resolution, the modest structure now serving as a personal retreat during Vermont visits. Inside, photographs chronicled recent milestones: the formal restoration of my inheritance, the establishment of the Conservation Trust, the corporate governance transitions. Alongside these newer images stood family photographs spanning generations, including several featuring Richard from happier times. I had neither erased him from family history, nor allowed his betrayal to permanently embitter my perspective. The complexity of family relationships resisted simple narratives of heroes and villains, a reality I had come to accept without surrendering principles or boundaries. Hannah Morris, my father's nurse who had risked so much to reveal the truth, now served as healthcare program director for the foundation, developing initiatives to support home healthcare workers. Her courage had been rewarded with opportunity to create systemic improvements in a field she valued deeply. Sullivan's investigation firm had received a substantial contract reviewing Harrison Construction's security protocols and governance practices, identifying vulnerabilities and implementing protections against future ethical breaches. His practical approach complemented Vernon's legal expertise in establishing new corporate safeguards. As evening approached, I sat on the cabin's porch, watching the interplay of fading light on flowing water. In the distance, a deer and fawn emerged from forest edge to drink from the river, living embodiments of what had been preserved through our intervention. My museum colleagues had been understanding about my divided attention during recent months, recognizing the importance of resolving family matters. I had maintained connection to the artistic world that had defined my pre-inheritance identity, now finding unexpected synergies between corporate leadership and cultural stewardship. The phone call that interrupted this contemplative moment came from an unexpected source, Thomas Reynolds, with news that would open yet another chapter in the Harrison legacy. The investigation into Richard's international financing sources has uncovered evidence of similar arrangements at 3 other development companies, he reported. Federal regulators are quietly building cases, but need expertise in identifying the patterns. They've specifically requested your involvement as a consultant, given your unique perspective on how these structures operate. The request presented intriguing possibilities, leveraging painful personal experience toward preventing similar situations elsewhere, perhaps establishing industry-wide reforms regarding financing transparency and environmental compliance. I'll need to review the scope and commitment required, I responded, already mentally rearranging upcoming obligations to accommodate this unexpected opportunity. They've emphasized this would be discreet advisory work, not public testimony, Reynolds clarified. understanding my reluctance to repeatedly revisit family trauma through media exposure. After concluding the call, I remained on the porch as darkness enveloped the Vermont landscape. Stars emerged above, mirrored in the river's surface as crickets and frogs established night's soundtrack. The journey from disinheritance to restoration had transformed not just my financial situation, but my fundamental understanding of responsibility, legacy, and purpose. The assets recovered were merely tools for advancing deeper values: harmony between development and conservation, balance between progress and preservation, integrity in both personal and corporate decision-making. My father's final letter had referenced rebuilding rather than retribution as my distinctive strength. That insight had proven prophetic, as reconstruction of family legacy had demanded precisely that capacity. Not merely reclaiming what was lost, but reimagining what might be created from the fragments. 3 months earlier, I had stood in this same spot questioning whether any inheritance was worth the battle that had consumed my life. Now, with perspective granted by resolution, I recognized that the true inheritance had never been merely financial. It encompassed values, vision, and the courage to defend both when threatened. Richard's betrayal had triggered a crisis, but also catalyzed transformation that might not have occurred through gentler evolution. From that painful crucible had emerged stronger corporate governance, enhanced environmental protections, and, perhaps most importantly, clearer personal purpose. As I prepared to return to Boston the following morning for foundation meetings, I gathered wildflowers from the meadow near the cabin, a simple bouquet arranged in a mason jar that had belonged to my grandmother. This humble tradition connected generational transitions across decades, a ritual of continuity amid change. Margaret's parting words from our afternoon meeting echoed as I completed final preparations for departure. "Your father would be proud, not just of what you've preserved, but what you're building." That assessment, from someone who had known both my father and brother through their best and worst periods, carried particular weight. It acknowledged that legacy properly understood wasn't static preservation, but dynamic continuation. Adapting core principles to evolving circumstances while maintaining fundamental integrity. The inheritance I had fought for had ultimately proven far more valuable and complex than legal documents could encompass. It included responsibility for environmental stewardship, obligation to ethical business practices, and perhaps most challenging, the task of transforming family fracture into foundation for new beginnings. As morning light illuminated Vermont's mountains on departure day, I closed the cabin door with appreciation for all it represented in my journey. The battle for inheritance had concluded, but the work of inheritance, the living continuation of meaningful legacy, had only just begun. Some inheritances, after all, aren't merely received, but actively created from what preceded us. In that ongoing creation lay both the challenge and promise of whatever chapters would follow in the Harrison family story. Chapters I would now help write with clearer purpose and deeper understanding than I could have imagined when this journey began. What had started with loss had culminated in something more complex than simple restoration. The inheritance reclaimed included not just assets, but insight, not merely property but perspective. Currencies of lasting value that no legal document could either grant or remove. And in that realization lay perhaps the most meaningful inheritance of all: the freedom to move forward unburdened by either undeserved deprivation or unearned entitlement, carrying family legacy not as weight, but as foundation for building something worthy of those who would inherit from us in turn. The end.